Sorry.
Hello, can you hear me clear?
Hear you.
Okay. Do I still have time?
Yes. Do you want to take about 2 minutes and give it and wrap up your conclusion? You only had about 2 minutes, but since we had some difficulties, can you take about 2 minutes and give us your conclusion?
Okay, 2 minutes.
Yes, 2 minutes and give us your conclusion.
Okay, so by virtue of what I have found out was that blacks and blacks generally, wherever they find themselves, they happen to be part of the modern world. Because wherever you can find black people, you see them, they are not just there into fighting, selling drugs, or any other illicit or vices activities, but rather black people have made their significance in the world. For instance, the top athletes like Usain Bolt, Mike Jordan, Mike Tyson, Sir Percy Williams sisters, Serena and Venus. So these are all people that you can see around the world. They are blacks, but also they made a laudable kind of a contribution towards the world development. So that is not to say that even in Africa and the African leaders, they do realize that blacks are part and parcel of the emerging world society and have at one time or the other been in the forefront of supporting blacks' identities, cultural revival and identity. For instance, in the 1970s, Nigeria's president, young General Yakubu Gowon, had designed a kind of program for all African festivals of arts and culture known as the Festec Town, which was held in Lagos then. So also there was the issue of uniting all Africans from the shackles of colonialism that came up with the Manchester Conference of 1945, being championed by Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. So you can see that black people are conscious politically, socially, and economically wherever they found themselves. So by virtue of that, we will say that blacks' resilience in any situation is attainable, and they are part and parcel of the world emerging community. Thank you so much.
Fourth speaker join us, Anika Omadare. So we're going to turn now to Professor Lisa Lindsay, who will be presenting a paper titled Revolt on Unity, West African Women and Resistance in the Atlantic Slave Trade.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here with you today. I'll be bringing us back in time a bit because this is based on research about the 18th century and the Atlantic slave trade. And I think the connection with the other panel, with the other papers on this panel, is that this is some of the beginnings of the modern African diaspora in the massive transatlantic slave trade. So I begin with the story of one slaving ship. In mid-1770, a British ship called the Unity sailed from West Africa, actually the port of Ouidah in the Republic of Benin, to Kingston, Jamaica, carrying 425 captives. And in some ways, this ship was typical. It was just one of thousands of voyages that carried some 12 million people against their will to the Americans. But the voyage was also unusual for two reasons. One was that the majority of captive prisoners in its hold were women. Overall, in the transatlantic slave trade, about 2/3 of the prisoners were men and 1/3 were women. In this particular ship, however, women were more than 50%. So that was one reason it was unusual. The second reason it was unusual is that the prisoners on this ship rose in revolt multiple times during the voyage across the Atlantic, not just once, not just within sight of land, but at least 5 times over the course of the journey across the Atlantic, even in the middle of the ocean. And we know this because the ship log has been preserved, the captain's log. If you go down to, I think the 3rd slide, we have a picture of the captain's log. There are also some other sources because the captain, 20 years after the voyage, gave testimony to Parliament about his activities as a slave trader. And then he also wrote a memoir about trading with the kingdom of Dahomey that he published. And then the European ports at the port of Ouida also left records. If you could keep going, yes, all of these records are the way that I've been trying to reconstruct this particular slaving voyage. And it was unusual for the reasons that I told you, but in some ways it was actually part of a larger pattern. There's 2 reasons why it was part of a larger pattern. First of all, as many historians have pointed out, resistance was actually very typical on slave ships. Documented resistance exists on at least 10% of slaving voyages. The historians have recovered. And when they've looked at the statistical evidence, they've seen 10% at least of slaving voyages had resistance, and statistically, ships that had more women had more resistance. If there were more women, it was more likely that a ship would have revolt. And historians have explained this by saying, oh, it's because women were not guarded as aggressively as men were. And it's in the ship log for this particular voyage, we see this. The women were not kept in shackles 24 hours a day the way men were. And they were kept in a different part of the ship. And sometimes women, in fact, were used to help prepare food for the other captives. And so they were able to move about a bit. And so this is believable that women had more opportunities for revolt. But I want to actually make another argument on the basis of this particular ship, but also, I think, more generally. And that is that the correlation between women and revolts is not only because women had the opportunity, but because women who entered slaving ships were sold to Europeans more often than men, precisely because they were already rebellious, that they were already rebellious in the societies that they came from in Africa. And that's part of the reason that they ended up on slave ships to begin with. Men, unfortunately, were sold to Europeans for any number of reasons. Captured in warfare, captured by bandits, captured by kidnappers, bad luck, debts, what have you. And women were sold to Europeans for all of those reasons too, but more often than for men as a punishment because they had misbehaved. They had somehow offended political leaders or merchant elites. And so I want to spell this argument. Oh, you've gotten way ahead. If you could go back a little bit. Maybe the next one. Let's just stay there. I want to spell out this argument in general, but also with the particular case of this voyage that I'm honing in on, and show you how they're linked. So in general, the basic dynamics of the African side of the slave trade is that what historians have referred to as predatory states, and also non-state actors like bandits and warlords, captured people to trade with Europeans in order to get goods that made them more wealthy and powerful within Africa, of course. And so they were exchanging people, usually taken from outside of their own societies, in order to make themselves more powerful in their own societies. But there's a gendered aspect to this. When raiders or kidnappers or armies took people captive. They took people captive probably in more or less equal numbers, men and women and children. But then they were more likely to sell the men through merchants, through a series of markets towards the coast to Europeans. And they were more likely to sell the women to elites of one kind or another, political elites, merchant elites in Africa. Because of course, as you know, there was slavery in Africa too. And African slaveholders preferred female slaves, and European slaveholders preferred male slaves. So it worked out that there was some complementarity. And so when people were captured, women were more likely to stay within Africa, even if they were enslaved, and men were more likely to be sold to Europeans. So that's the general dynamic. But it begs the question, okay, so how come some women were in fact sold to Europeans? As we know, about, like I said, about 1/3 of the captive prisoners sold to Europeans were women. So what about them? Some of them were sold for all of the same reasons that men were. Some because they happened to be closer to the coast, and so it made sense logistically to sell them that way. But slave traders' own records are full of instances where they purchased women who were sold as punishment for one thing or another. They had offended the king. They had offended their husband. They were too old to have children. They looked at the wrong man or touched the wrong man. And European slave traders, with their racist assumptions about African women, labeled all of this adultery. And so the European slave trader sources are full of references where they say, I purchased this woman because of adultery. But that is overlooking the fact that what was going on the African side was that African slaveholders, many of them who were becoming quite wealthy, were amassing more and more and more wives who were not supposed to even look at another man. And when they did, as they did, because people resisted this situation, then they were sold as punishment. And that's what Europeans call adultery. And so we can see this in the particular instance of the kingdom of Dahomey, now in Republic of Benin, which is the origin of the people on the Unity. And so that's why I put up these maps. The captives who ended up on this particular ship, I've already lost track of time, were sold, many of them, by the king of Dahomey. I've been tracking down where these people came from and so on. And many of them were purchased, in fact, when the captain of the ship was summoned to the ceremonies at the Dahomey capital, Abomey. And so he traveled up country to Abomey, and he was summoned by the king in time for an annual ceremony that Europeans wrote about and called the annual customs. If you go to the next slide. Oh, sorry, maybe the next one. That's me. There we go. That one. So every year at the Capitol, there would be an annual festival where people were summoned to come to the Capitol to pay their taxes, to receive their presents and gifts from the king. So in this great cycle of distribution, people would pay their taxes and tribute, the king would give some out, the king would appoint officers, and what was required to be paid to the king was his share of people taken as slaves by the army and raiders. But also every household or every village was required to turn over young men to serve in the army and young women to serve in the palace organization. And here's the end of the ceremony where the king is throwing out cowrie shells, distributing also patronage and money to all of his followers. And you can see the Europeans sitting up there on the right. The Europeans were required to attend, but it was also a way of affirming to the Europeans by the king, hey, you are among my subordinate chiefs also. Thanks. And so if I can go on further, the king amassed thousands of women in a massive palace organization that was part arm of the state and part polygynous household. And some of the women were enslaved and some of the women were free and some of them were quite elite at various statuses, but none of them were allowed to marry anyone but the king. So we're talking about thousands of women, some of whom may have never even seen the king in their lifetime, but they were supposed to be wives of the king. And if they resisted, as many of them did, they were sold to Europeans. And the Europeans said, oh, that's because of adultery. And so for Europeans, that created sexualized ideas about African women. But it's really about their resistance to this concentration of wealth and male power that was coming from the slave trade. And so to get back to the unity, years after the voyage, the ship captain Robert Norris was asked when he testified before Parliament, when you purchased people, why were they sold to you? And he said, I understand from them in general, they have been sold for the crime of adultery. But I think my hypothesis is that he was purchasing women who had resisted the king in one way or another. And then once they got on board the ship, I will wrap it up, we can go to the end. I'll just tell you about these quickly, these 5 revolts. Yeah, I've plotted them on a timeline. June 40th, 40 men in irons, June 4th, June 6th, the slaves made an insurrection, 12 with the loss of 2 women, so we know women were on that one. June 22, the slaves attempted another insurrection, secured them in a change, gave the women 24 lashes each. June 26, got out of their handcuffs, were detected in time. The next day, they attempted to force up the gratings in the night to murder the wives or drown themselves, the women as well as the men. So and I plotted them actually on Google Maps, so you can see this is happening all the way across the Atlantic. And again, my point is that we need to see the Middle Passage and resistance in the Middle Passage, not only leading to resistance among enslaved people in the Americas, but linked to resistance in Africa, and that had very much to do with women as well as men. Okay, thank you.
Great. So we're going to be shifting gears back to our online presenters. And our next presenter is Anike Omodare, whose paper is titled 2 Decades of Implementation and Deconstruction of Eurocentric Ideology on Africa in Brazil.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. I want to try and share my slide. Maybe I'll be able to get it from here. On my PowerPoint page, I sent it to the email of the conference organizer. I want to see if I can just project it from here. But while I'm doing that, I will go on the introductory parts. Oh, it's asking me to do so many things. I sent it to the email of the conference organizers this morning. I'm sorry for that. I've been in transit, so that delayed somehow. I don't know if they'll be able to project the PowerPoint slide from their side there. If not, I will just go over the presentation. So what I have here is the 2 decades of implementation and reconstruction of Eurocentric ideology on Africa in Brazil. We are just like the previous presenter given to us. We've gotten a part of the slavery history and the likes, and in the situation of Brazil from the abolition of slavery in 1888, the historians and many writers have given us a lot of okay. Don't worry. I'm sorry about that. I sent it to the email this morning, and to the email of the panel chair this morning too. But no problem. So the historians like Gilberto Frei had a book that is titled A Casa Grande Senzala, which is the big house and the plantation. And we have some other authors like Joan Reis, Kabengele Mulanga, Gabriel Soares de Souza, Lisa El Castillo. Many of them, they have written a lot about the situation of slavery in Brazil and the aftermath of slavery. Brazil is the second largest Black country outside Nigeria. And because of that highest concentration of the Black people in Brazil, there have been a lot of struggle and a lot of manifestation towards the affirmation of the Black identity. Like the Angolan Museum Director, Afonso Vita, affirmed just this week in Angola, while a family of Tucker family from US visited Angola in a way of reconnecting to their roots. He declared that the Americas were constructed by the blood and the participations of Angolas, in quotes, of all Blacks that were enslaved. And the aftermath of this slavery and the likes was that there was a systemic exclusion of the Blacks and the Afro descendants in Brazil. Then it came to the bracket, what we call the whitening of the Brazilians. The then leaders thought that the more they allowed the immigrants, the European immigrants into Brazil, the more they will be able to clean off the Black blood and the Black race. Unfortunately, that was not accomplished. And then what do we have after that was the repression of the Afro-Brazilian, the poverty level so much up till now, the racism, the religious intolerance, violence, and a classified extermination of the Afro-Brazilian youth was established, that any Black that is seen, any young Black that is seen, is considered to be a criminal, is considered to be a drug mullah, like they call them. So the police do go over them, run after them, and before you know it, when they arrest them, they already have a criminal kit, whereby they put a gun, some drugs and everything, cocaine, all the likes, and then it is placed before the Black youth as an evidence against them. Now, looking at all this situation of the Black, the rate of poverty and the likes, and the situation they face in terms of racism within the Brazilian society, the Movimento Negro, the Black movement, and some Brazilian activists continue to fight, continue to raise their voices towards the affirmation of the Black race and a good condition for the Black people in Brazil. And so there came about the political intervention that, political intervention that gave them the quota system for auto-declared people of color in Brazil. it is only given to auto declare people of color. If you declare yourself to be Moreno, Pada, Black, and the likes, you can enjoy the quota system within the admission of in the educational sector. That is, you want to get an admission into the university or higher institution. And also for work employment, there is a 20% also reserved under this quota system to work to protect the Black race so that they can get engaged within the labor force. And then in 2003, during the regime of Lula, the current president, now there was a law, sorry, I call it in Portuguese, I'm sorry. There was a law that was decreed that it is tagged 10,639/2003 law that mandated it that there should be the inclusion of Afro-Brazilian history and culture in schools. That was given by 9th January 2003. And what the daybreak of that was that all schools from primary to secondary school must have a subject whereby they can be, the pupil and student can be taught the Afro-Brazilian history and culture. And because of that, the Ministry of Education, there was no specific manpower or professionals trained towards that declaration of that law. So it became very difficult for the educational sectors to implement immediately the law was given. So many historian experts were thrown into schools so that they can work and do that. But we know that pure history is not like what they really need. They want a mixture of culture and some other things. And also, they also want people that are learning about the African continent. Okay. And so the Ministry of Education started rolling out training for their teachers. And from the federal government to the state government intervention, that is why I brought in as the sample of the implementation of this law via the municipal intervention of Lauro de Freitas in Bahia State in Brazil. And so this local government, how they are now trying to implement this law, because we discovered that generally Brazilians, the history of Africa they got is not like, we call it more of lies than the truth. So the municipal government of Lauro de Freitas that has 8 zones or 8 regions decided to, under their municipal educational secretariat, created some units that will handle the training of teachers in all subjects in which the culture is also included. Okay, and then they have the unit for the Afro-Indigenous people. They have the unit for inclusion and diversity. They have the technical group for monthly workshop for teachers, which I participated from last year. And so what do we do in this monthly workshop for the teachers is that I, as an African, I am charged with bringing in topics that will enlighten them about Africa. Because you hear some of them asking, how can I get African passports? And then you have to start to break it down for them that we know it's possible to get a Brazilian passport, but it's not possible to have an African passport because the African continent has more than 50 countries. So we started introducing topics that can brighten and widen their horizon about the knowledge about Africa, and through which they can take back to the classroom, to their pupils and to their students. And the topics, some of the topics that we have treated in this teachers workshop towards the implementation of the law are the African as a continent ourselves, Pan-Africanism towards the way to liberty and affirmation of African identity, colonization in Africa, because they don't have any knowledge about the way the Africa is run at all. They look at Africa as a single country, as a single state. And so we have to break it down for them to understand the Lusophone part of Africa, the Anglophone and the Francophone. Thank you very much. I'm rounding up. Okay, and so we have Nigeria and our cultural diversity, Angola and our cultural diversity, linguistic analysis, language and dialectology, because to Brazilian, Africa has just dialects. They don't see us as a continent that has languages. So we have to break it down for them. And through the theory of escrevivencia of Conceição Evaristo, who is a Brazilian theorists, I was able to open up to them to be able to see what they live and what we have here back in Africa. So what are the feedback from the teachers from this workshop is the curriculum development in this municipal government. We are able to participate with the teachers to be able to bring in new things into the curriculum development, exposition of classroom condition, how are they managing the themes of culture in the classroom and the history of Afro-Brazilian, teacher support for creativity and special intervention, just like myself that I was contracted in that local government as an external instructor, and also the textbook. How can we bring out textbook? Because up till now, there is no specified textbook towards this area of subjects for the pupils. And then we have the problem of demonization of the culture teachers. They are seen as diabolic. They are seen in the classroom as diabolic because of the Candomblé religion, which is more or less the Yoruba traditional religion, African traditional religion, Bantu, Kimbundu, and all the like. So we have to simplify ways they can get into the pulpits and to the system in a way that they can be accepted and they will be able to work towards anti-racist education, civilization of the pupils via what they see, and also to open their mind to the plurality and diversity in the African history and African culture. And so the major problem that the implementation of this law that we see via the workshops and the work with the teachers is that there is lack of fund to be able to produce the textbooks which they will be able to use. Still, we still have insufficient teachers that are trained as culture teachers. They are not history teachers, but to be culture teachers in the classroom so that they can work for the implementation of the law, racism as usual, religious intolerance also. So all these are still some of the issues that we are trying to wait at to be able to get a good implementation of this law, which can help to better the life affirmation of Afro-Brazilian identity, valorization of their culture and of their being as a Black race. So my conclusion is that the weight of implementation of this law is high on the municipal governments because they are very close to the people, they are close to the background. And the effort that is in making is that we are having a progressive effort as at this moment that is making a gradual impact on the national conscience and towards the valorization of Afro-Brazilian culture and history. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So we have about 20 minutes for questions, and our panelists have put a rich menu of topics on the table, ranging from thinking about the resilience of African identities in Haiti, looking at Black African identities across the diaspora over time, looking at the question of resistance amongst African women in the context of the slave trade. And then lastly, a really important paper that helps us to think about, what does it mean to sort of sit in spaces like this and sort of be creators of knowledge and to present this knowledge in a higher education context. But what does it then look like to sort of implement that at other levels of the education system? And so I think, again, it's been a really rich group of papers, and I just want to open the floor for questions.
Department of European Studies. I'm introducing myself. Now, in 2006, President Lula invited us. I went from University of Lagos. The Vice Chancellor sent me to Bahia. The town was El Salvador in Bahia, to go and teach Yoruba language. Now, who was speaking? The person speaking, there are no books. There are no lecturers. But now, why I stood up is that when I came back from El Salvador, I've written textbooks for them, but I don't know how to return it to El Salvador. Yoruba books, Yoruba plays, Yoruba theater, and even Haiti can do Haiti. I didn't go to Haiti, but I teach Haiti voodoo that we're talking about. So all these books, some I wrote them in French. The language, literature, and Yoruba civilization for Haiti. For Haiti. They are here. And how, since they did not have books, when Lula asked me to come July 2006, now that you now have books, how do I send you? You can have your own. How do I give these books to them? I don't know. And you also, you have already. Do you have this? The question is, how do I give these books, Yoruba language and linguistics? I sat down more than 20 years to write all this, but there is no way I can send it to Salvador, I think. The town was Salvador. I ate amala, I ate eba, I ate beans, and I ate akara. In that Salvador, that I was very happy that I was at home. But then now that I've written the books for them, how do we ship them? Some of them are there. Some of the books, they are there where you register. You can buy for them. You have some of them so that nobody has done as much as myself, 150 books. I was so, how can we help these people? So who is the woman there that needs this? And you need it also. Your own book is La longue littérature et civilisation Yoruba. Are you with me? I took it to Bahia. I took them to Bahia. But so how do you get them to them, either in Haiti and to Bahia? Now, Lula has made Yoruba a national language. The same Lula has made Yoruba a national language. I've written a dictionary of a dictionary of Yoruba language. But how do you send to? No, you must answer it. They have funds. Those who organize this have funds to ship them to Bahia or ship them to this. And the sociology of the Yoruba people, 520 pages I wrote, they are here. They should go to, you can't keep quiet when they have no textbooks. They have no textbooks. I was there, no textbook. I was a professor already then, more than 20 years ago. I said, let me write for them. But me, I just keep quiet doing my business. I don't know how to send the books. How do I send the books? Who do I give the books so that they can multiply it in Bahia or in Sampoli? God be blessed. That's my own. So note my name and you put my name there and let them get back to me. My telephone number, GSM is here. My email is here. I've written all these many books because I went to Brazil 2006. So now they have textbooks to study Yoruba and language, literature, theater, and the rest of them. Wait, I went to Nigerian Cultural Center Nigeria Cultural Center in Bahia. I donated all the books I brought from Lagos. I donated them to Nigeria Cultural Center. Go there and make photocopy from the Nigeria ambassador in Bahia. I'm a workaholic, but I didn't want these people to go without the knowledge of who they are. That's why I donated those books. Please note that all these young graduates, but it's important to save them. They have no books. Thank you. So that's why I came here. So one down.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I was really interested in the stories you told about the gender dynamics with regards to the revolt on the ship, which it is not often talked about, like the gender aspect. However, I'm interested in also knowing, can you explain how maybe like one of these revolts served as an inspiration to the next revolt that is gender oriented? Because I've read a couple of books that talks about how communication is still being made even when the enslaved Africans are on the ship. So if you have any story to that narrative, I'll be interested.
Get two more questions and then I will let the panelists respond.
I have a question. Like, my question is, they took 12 million slaves, right? Where were like most of the slaves taken?
In the context of the larger trade, so to that distribution of stuff within the slave trade. Okay.
I have two questions. I'll make sure. Okay, so for this book, I wanted to ask about if you could tell more about the connections you see between Haiti and the continent in terms of voodoo. You mentioned a little bit, but could you tell us a little more? Oh, yes. And then for Dr. Lindsay, I wanted to ask how in the, I think Jennifer, this is a great both presentation, fabulous. I wanted to ask about differences between 17th and 18th century, where women and children are the primary captives going to the Americas in 17th. What's happening, do you think? Is it the same question of misbehavior, quote unquote, or is there something else going on? Thank you.
Okay, we'll pause right there and let our panelists respond, and then we'll hopefully maybe do one more round.
I have answers for three people, but maybe Grace should go first, and then I'll just do all three at once.
Okay, with regards to Buddhism, it's gift.
Sorry, gift. My bad.
No problem. Okay, so with regards to Buddhism, Buddhism is actually a word that originated from the Dahomean language. Dahomean language, just Dahomey. She mentioned Dahomey in her speech. It's one of the ancient kingdoms in West Africa before this time, in present-day Benin Republic. So it's a religion that evolved from there. And although it is not really practiced the same way it is now in Haiti, the same way it was practiced, that is because it has undergone several challenges and several difficulties. For instance, the Spaniards tried, and the French, of course, tried to impose Catholicism on the people. So what does this Buddhism involve? It involved like communicating with the spirits. And how do they do this? They do this through rituals. They make sacrifices. One example we see during the before the Haitian Revolution kicked off, I mentioned about the voodoo ceremony at Bois Cayman in 1791. So during that voodoo ceremony, they killed a black sheep. They sacrificed the black sheep, and then they used the blood of that sheep to make an oath. So that gave them the courage, because they had belief that with this that they have done, the revolution was going to be a success. So Buddhism involved, and apart from the one supreme God, they believe in a one supreme God called Bondye, just like the Yoruba believe in Olodumare. And Olodumare is the supreme God, but he has other gods below him, like the Ogun, Shango, just like that. the Bondi also have subservient gods lower than him. They call them the Luas. So the Luas are spirits, and they have different names, and they are specific for different things. Like there is the Ougwa, there is the Dambala, there is Papa Gede. So they have different specifications, and the people engage the spirits. And in fact, there are times where the spirits possess them, and they make some declarations and some displays, and people have that belief that the spirit is speaking to them. So they are able to communicate with the spirits, and spirits serve as an intermediary between them and the supreme God. So they worship them and they sacrifice to them, make rituals and ceremonies. I don't know if this has thrown more light. Thank you.
Okay, so the first question was about the links between revolts, and I am interpreting that to mean the five that I talked about. This ties together actually with Gift's answer, because interestingly enough, many of the revolts on that particular ship seem correlated with outbreaks of smallpox. The ship log talks about outbreaks of smallpox, and in the pantheon of the area that was providing people to this slave ship, there was a smallpox deity, Sakpata. I think in Yoruba it's Shampona. So there's a smallpox god. And people have written about how in Dahomey, this smallpox deity was considered to be an opponent to the king. That the people who were against the monarchy would become worshippers of this particular god. And smallpox outbreaks were interpreted as signs that of divine opposition to what the king was doing. And so I think it's very interesting that these revolts seem timed with outbreaks of smallpox. It's like people were thinking, oh, I've got some divine help. It's time to go. So that's my best guess. And so much of this is unknowable because the only sources we have are written by the ship. But I think that's a very tantalizing clue. The question about where were most enslaved people in the transatlantic slave trade taken, the answer is Brazil. So that ties in with the last paper as well. Something like, if I'm remembering right, 40% were taken to Brazil, another third to the Caribbean, very small portion to the part of the world that became the United States, something like 5%. So Brazil is the answer. The question that obviously comes from Jennifer Morgan's work on the 16th century slave trade, which did have much more higher proportions of captive women than in the 17th century. I would have to go back and look at the numbers from the slave trade database and all of that, but my best guess of an answer right now is that in the 18th century the slave trade was so much bigger than in the previous time. That massive expansion happened largely by enslaving more men. And that all of those processes that were generating more and more captive people, warfare, banditry, and so on, were especially targeted there. And so I think Jennifer Morgan's work shows that early period was more heavily female. I mean, I don't think it was a majority female, but I think it was more female. And then less female in the 18th century. And then in the 19th century, it's interesting, the patterns change again. There's more children. This is sort of sickening to be talking about in these statistical terms, but you can see some change over time. But where I would like to have taken sort of a different turn than this historian Jennifer Morgan, who's written about the 16th century slave trade and gender, is that I'm much more interested in the linkages between that and West African history. and what that has to do with who became enslaved, who were those people, and what was their history before they got out of slavery.
I think we have time for a couple more questions, so.
Yeah, thank you. So,
Please.
you answered a question, but
I'm talking about the link between slavery and the manifestation of health crisis during the course of the Middle Passage. So I was going to ask an addendum to that, right? Was there or were there outbreaks of health crisis possibly on plantations? And if they were, I mean, could you please illuminate on that? What were those diseases or those crises? How were they managed and things like that?
Have any other questions? 4 minutes. Okay. Actually, I'm gonna take that as a sign that will be our last question. I'll have it wrap up.
Okay, I am not an expert on slavery in America, and slavery in American plantations. There is a professor at Harvard whose name is escaping me right now, who's working on that very question, and I'll have to look it up for you. But there are studies that look at African health practices among enslaved populations in the Americas. And I think it would be fascinating, for instance, to look at smallpox and to see how people were managing that. On this particular ship that I'm looking at, one of the things that the slave trader wrote about is that he said women were, or as he put it, playing with beads and dancing. Well, if you want to reach the orishas, you throw beads, right? And you throw cowries. And so I think when they were playing with beads, there's a lot more significance to that than what the slave traders were talking about. Then also we talked about them doing their quote native dances. And so I think there's some management of disease and also communication with spirits that the European sources are only showing a little glimpse of.
With that, I want to thank both the audience and our presenters today for a fabulous conversation. And I'm going to release everybody to go to lunch today.
Thank you, everyone.
Hello.
Thanks for that.
Hello, please. Hello, please.
This is your first presentation.
Hello.
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 Hello. Two presenters online.
Please, I would like to quickly comment on what Prof said. What I am referring to as textbooks, as lack of textbooks, they are the recommended books for the children in schools. We've been having books and Yoruba teachers in Brazil from the 80s. Babalola Yayi from Benin Republic was the first Yoruba teacher at Siao in Salvador, Bahia, where Prof visited. And Pierre Veger came to Nigeria from the 50s. So we have in and out the influence and experience of this contact. But what we are saying, we have a lot of book on Felisa Yomidire, which is on Yoruba culture. But the slavery, as it was explained here, please kindly listen to this, my last comment. It's not just about Nigeria. It's about the African continent. So we have books that have to do with Yoruba culture and the likes, and we appreciate what Prof produced too. But as the coordinator of Yoruba Institute and Culture in the Federal University of Bahia, I can tell you that what the government need is compilation of all African culture and history in a way that can benefit the pupils and students as their own recommended textbook, not as the general book that we produce on African nations, African languages, and African cultures. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. So, let's get one photo.
Yeah. God, I have it. Short. And I have you all email, so I can easily just get it back to you. I'm trying to get the other two presenters.
Let's put it on.
Anike, are you still there? Thank you for staying on. I'll send it to you.